like a trucker.
I know I do, except not as much facial hair as a trucker would have.
I think the perfect amount. It's like enough creepy to, I don't know, to
Dude, my
intimidate me.
problem is that my mustache grows at like a much faster rate than my beard. So
A sure,
I have the
a
pedophile
sure
mustache
sign of
like
pedophilia. Yes.
2 days into not being shaved. But my beard doesn't fill in again for like another week and a half. So it's just like a week and a half of just pedo mustache.
Yeah, and you're wearing the camo hat and the flannel buttoned up, and it's
I
just
love this hat.
real,
Shout
real,
out
real trucker vibes.
Raul Rogue Methods. Fucking sexy ass hat for a
Yeah,
sexy ass guy.
real trucker vibes.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah. Today, Alex, what are we talking about?
yeah. On to the main stuff.
Yeah, the main
We're gonna
course.
talk about a little bit of training the trunk and misconceptions with that. So, in a sense, like, would you rather have a six pack? Would you rather have a keg? Right? We want that power barrel. We want the strength that accompanies it, or we want the vanity and the good looks. Right?
Both.
I want both. Yeah, and I have both, so it's fine.
Oh, okay.
Um, shameless. Um, but yeah, so we're going to talk about how to train for both, what you should train, and then clear up some misconceptions on the way. So, Austin, what's your step one on training the trunk?
Well, first of all, do you want a six pack or do you want a power barrel or a keg, as he lovingly said? I prefer my athletes to have some sort of tone to the abdomen because we need a strong abdominal wall. So sometimes it's a six pack, but it doesn't have to be. But I care way more about the power barrel and being able to expand into 360 degrees and brace all the way through the spine, trunk, and back as well, or more than just the rectus six pack, just 8 pack muscles that look great, but aren't necessarily super functional outside of just flexing your trunk because that is their goal. Your rectus
Right,
abdominis, your 6 pack muscle, its number one goal is to just flex your trunk. It's not actually to stabilize the core.
right, and then like having the six packs or like the shredded core, right? That like communicates two things to me. Like communicates that you've done a lot of concentric like core, like abdominal crunches, like GHD crunches, etc. Like you've done a lot of concentric action bending forward, right?
Yep.
Which nah, whatever.
Right, you
Second thing
need it for MMA. You need it, but
right,
it's not exclusively what your core does.
and then second thing communicates to me is that you have a low percentage of body fat, right? That you
Right.
are relatively fit and that you're not obese enough to have adipose shadowing that, which you would hope in a sport like MMA. But I mean, that's really all like a six pack does for me. Otherwise, when we're looking at the keg, you're exactly right. Looking at the 360-degree expansion, are you able to expand? Are you strong in every plane of motion through your core, strong enough to hold a good bracing strategy, a good position,
How do you get
and
that?
not be deformed? Well, we talked about breathing, right?
Yep.
Breathing, period. And then you,
Well,
you learn the difference between breathing and bracing, right? That's been, I
Well,
think, a
so
focal
that's what I
point.
would argue. So everybody thinks breathing, right? Being able to expand and breathing is the primary way to do it, right? That's the basis behind everything. But I feel like so many people don't realize like farmers carries, while great for the forearm, they're actually a trunk exercise, being able to
Right.
expand and brace your core. Payloft presses. You can mix them up a whole bunch of different ways. Like when we're recording this podcast, part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this in the first place was because I was on Twitter and I'm on Strength Coach Twitter because I just like to see the different ideas. And recently there's been a trend of people shitting on Payloft presses because they're not at the same rate or they're not at the same intensity or they're not at the same speed of sport for MMA. And while that's cool and like I understand that if you're maximally training the core, if that's your goal, but if we're trying to elevate a functional capacity, or maybe we make them single leg, or maybe we make them a dead bug position, there's a lot of different applications you can have for a Payloft press that are actually extremely functional and focused on that pressurization in nature.
Yeah, and back to the like bracing strategy, like I look at it like learning to do like a hard breath, right? Or breathe in, expand, stabilize maximally. That's like learning to one rep max on the
Yep.
deadlift, right? Useful to an extent, right? We
Right.
need
Exactly.
to have that, but the ability to scale, engage up and down with your like contraction is a skill within itself. and we only need to brace so long. Like if you're doing a farmer carry for, let's say, 50 yards, it's going to take you upward of 15, 20 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot hold your breath and singularly brace and effectively complete that exercise,
Right.
right? You're going to get way too fatigued. You're going to um, focus way too hard on the breath and the bracing over every other small little detail, right? So we need to stabilize and brace just enough, up and down a continuum of contraction, not only exclusively learn how to do it at maximal capacity.
100%. And I think I've said it on our podcast a couple times, but I think that is the greatest distinguisher of separating good athletes from great athletes as far as skill acquisition.
Yeah,
Being able to grade your bracing exposure and grade your bracing percentage, and the trade off with that and respiratory rate is invaluable as an athlete.
yeah,
Off
especially
my
MMA.
soapbox, back to core training. That's why I love my weighted carries so much. Like different variations, not just farmers carries. Heavy ass med balls. Walking around, I'm talking 100 to 150 pound med balls, just walking around and carrying those. Overhead carries, which are going to challenge you to be able to expand the back because it forces you to arch your back to get to that position. Like all of these different carry variations are a fantastic way. Yeah, they're going to tax the shoulder. Yeah, you're going to get some grip strength. But the main objective can be and should be trunk training, and that's how we make a unsexy topic of talking about kegs and not six packs to be a little bit more sexy,
Oh
because
yeah, 100.
carries can be sexy and they're fucking hard.
Yeah, carries should be fucking hard. Like I think pail off presses should be fucking hard too. Like
Mm-hmm.
I would not criticize pail off press for it not being specific to competition or whatever. I would criticize pail off press or yeah, pretty much pail off press and a little bit of carries, and nobody scales them up and down in intensity continuum,
Right, they're
right? Like
chronically underloaded.
exactly. You think of a pail off press. All right, we're gonna do light enough weight you can press in and out 10 times and hold your core. It's like no, motherfucker. If our goal for this block is absolute strength, load that shit up,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then do a 10-second hold, right?
If
I
it's
have
power, make it ballistic.
exactly like you can change all of these exercises to go after the strength quality that you're targeting within your program, right? I have a athlete that's doing an absolute strength block. He's doing max effort on the trap bar, okay, and then he goes into a max effort med ball squeeze,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're looking at the ability to have a repeat effort of maximal bracing or breathing, right? In this scenario, to have that skill readily available,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this athlete specifically plays rugby, where a lot of times when he goes into a scrum or a ruck, he is maximally engaging and has to have that rapid fire turn on brace,
Yep.
right? So that's my soapbox on core training, trunk stability is like work with it up and down the continuum. Don't just think like, okay, we're doing a little core accessory exercise. Let's plank for 30 seconds. And that's
Yep.
all we ever do for the core, right? Or we're gonna pail off press. You have to do 8 to 10 reps on the pail off press. It's like, no, we can modify and vary these exercises, and our athletes will get better at them, right? That's
Yeah.
again
I,
another argument. Sorry, I'll go on my soapbox one more time.
Let's
Variety
hear it.
in an exercise is going to make the athlete better at the exercise or better at the skill that you're trying to acquire,
Yeah.
right? So I talked about breathing and maximally contracting your trunk, similarly to 1 rep maxing on the deadlift. That 1 rep max on the deadlift is an isolated skill. If we only ever 1 rep max on the deadlift, I'm not necessarily going to know or be able to readily apply the deadlift pattern when I'm not lifting a maximal load,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if I offer variety in the hinging pattern, in the trap bar deadlift, we're doing trap bar jumps. Then we're just going to do moderate effort, 4 sets to 6. Then we're going to go maximal effort, right? And we're not jumping around day to day or whatever, but we're offering variety in exercise. Now my athlete has the skill of a hinge, and they know how to apply that skill in many different contexts, which is ultimately our goal to get them to apply it in an MMA setting, which is the most dynamic. So I
100%.
think the variety there and controlling that and seeing that for what it is really key, not just locking ourselves into, all right, we're doing trap bar deadlifts. You have to only do trap bar deadlifts heavy.
Yeah, and I feel like another key is understanding what the core's function is, because I don't feel like it's actually understood by the non-strength training and healthcare people what the core is supposed
Sure,
to do.
sure.
The reason why a six pack isn't as preferred as this expansion based movement is your core is supposed to be your power transfer, right? That is
Mm-hmm,
literally the thing in the middle that every other muscle and system and appendage can pull off of to generate force or power.
mm-hmm.
The core is not just flexing your trunk. That actually, I would argue, probably destabilizes the job of the trunk, which is expansion and stability, right? That's going to push you
But
more towards
yeah.
just one movement, which you're going to see those super big six pack people that can push a bunch of weight, and then you do anything posterior chain and they get fucked, right? Um, so when we think about the core, it's not doing sit-ups, it's not being able to hold a sit-up, it's not a bunch of that. It's the ability to have a stable center of your body for everything else to pull off of to generate high amounts of force or power.
Yeah, 100%, and that's where you see the rise in training the core of like these anti type of movements,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm doing anti rotation, payload press. I'm doing anti extension. I'm doing anti flexion, right? Anti lateral flexion, like a suitcase carry, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to resist those movements and resist deformity to the core, so that our expansion and our keg becomes more bulletproof. Right now, we don't just have aluminum, thin ass um, abdominal wall material. We have like a thick, like a 3/4 inch thick
We
metal
got
keg.
Kevlar up in this bitch.
Fuck yeah. And that's where I think that's the evolution of core training. I read a good blog post on it. And of course, I'm going to space on it. Maybe we'll add it in the show notes. But it's like the evolution of trunk training to give our limbs more power,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the ultimate goal. Like our trunk holds position and transfers force from our feet to our hands in most scenarios, right? Or foot to foot in a kick or whatever. But I kind of think about it like a slingshot. If I have a slingshot and I'm trying to shoot a rock or whatever as hard as I can, right? I want that handle on that slingshot to be made out of hardwood, metal, something solid, right? That's our core. If I'm shooting a rock and this slingshot's made out of silly putty or Play-Doh, that rock has no power to go anywhere, right? Because the
Right.
arms are going to deform, and then now my rubber band has less power,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you think of the sling, the rubber band as your arms or legs, and the base of the slingshot as your core, now we have some power, right? So I guess that's an analogy I've been pondering on.
I like it. I like
Sure.
it. I could dig. I
All
always use
right.
the cannon out of a canoe type
I
of
mean,
situation.
I'm sick of that one. Heard that one. Been there,
That's
done
fine.
that.
That's something to be said about an oldie but a goodie.
Sure, 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 sure.
But I guess, I mean, when we think about the core, and we already talked about the function of the core, I personally think that there's a step-by-step protocol you could use to learn a movement that the trunk is the most key portion of, right? So say like a farmer's carry, or
Mm-hmm.
let's do a suitcase carry because that's going to be lateral flexion.
Sure.
So how I
Anti-lateral
like to,
flexion.
yeah, lateral flexion. So how I like to teach that is I actually start with the breath. I'm going to start with them being able. You're just going to hold the weight and learn how to expand into that new concavity that is there, which is
Mm-hmm.
if you expand into that area, that'll cause uprighting of the spine. That'll actually even out that lateral shift. So that's going to be our anti-rotation. If all I do is say, "Hey, just reach your other hand towards your other heel and try to correct that movement," which is a very normal cue for a suitcase carry, then I'm literally just teaching them to ratchet their QL and try to drop that rib cage, and I'm just almost causing a compression on the other side. I'm not necessarily doing what I'm intending to do, which is stabilize my trunk in a more efficient way and resist that anti or that lateral flexion.
That's, by the way, the number one compensation I see in the suitcase carry is not that people give into the weight, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not what happens. People fight the weight so hard and they're so mechanically driven in this by, I mean mechanically, I mean muscular system, pulling away from the weight. I got to fight this weight so I turn the other way. It's like, no, we need to be
Well,
like,
and side note, before we go down too far of a rabbit hole, the opposite of what you talk about for payloff presses and carries is true for suitcase carries. So many people, you shouldn't, suitcase carries, the goal of a suitcase carry is trunk stability,
Right.
anti-lateral flexion. You shouldn't be suitcase carrying really more than about 35 pounds because it's not for your grip. It is for fixing that lateral shift.
Yeah.
And if you can't, and most people can't stabilize out of that lateral shift greater than 35 pounds, you got to be really fucking strong to do that.
Yeah.
And that
And a
comes with a lot
dynamic
of
motion,
exclamation on
right?
the first end or on the front end. I'm like, you
Yeah.
got to say, this is not a grip exercise. I don't care that you're not getting tired. We're fixing something here.
You could do a pinch
Yep.
carry, same,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems a little more hard, right? Or
True.
taxes the grip a little more. But
Exactly.
yeah, so
But
I like doing that.
but for suitcase carriers, if we're using that as an example on teaching the skill development of integrating the trunk or integrating the core strength, is I'll teach a bracing sequence and that breathing sequence of we need to expand into that concavity upright and try to stabilize that spine the best we can. Then after that, once we get the position down, I'm going to have them do a very minor loading pattern just to see can they hold it under just one increase to external stimulus, which is the addition of 2 steps forward. If I watch them do 2 steps on each side, and as soon as they take 1 step, they shift the opposite way and they lose all stability we just talked about, then I know I need to do more isometric loading patterns and take away the locomotion component because the goal of the exercise is stability. It's not necessarily the locomotion. I can add locomotion in other ways.
Yeah.
So if it's for stability, then I'm going to regress them back and I'm just going to have them hold that isometric over and over and over again. And it might get boring until I want to progress them forward. Or a good number that I use is you should be able to hold a hip shift with the weight that you're walking for over 45 seconds. If you can hold that suitcase carry without that lateral flexion for 45 seconds and stabilize in an effective manner, I know you're probably going to be able to do 20 yards out and 20 yards back in a suitcase carry. So a
Right.
40, which is what my turf is. So that's how I grade that in. And then once I understand that we did the desired portion A of stabilize and increase the isometric, once they can then B, add the locomotion component in without too much of a hip shift, it's never going to be perfect, but without too much of a hip shift, that right there is when I want to progress up on the loading scheme of maybe we started with 20 pounds. I'm progressing that up to 25, 27 pounds, whatever it may be, and having them hold that position. But I'm not going to increase the external load before they are extremely competent in the fine tuned skill of anti lateral flexion.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like the progression, right? We went from a static position, learning the skill, into static position capacity, into static position, or I guess not static position, a dynamic position, adding complexity.
Mm-hmm.
Then we add intensity, right? So it's like it goes capacity, complexity, intensity, which I love because, as I ranted about earlier, the complexity is the learning that's happening, right?
Yep.
That's the next stage of the learning rather than like drill, 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 repetitive practice, repetitive practice will help you learn a skill, right? Especially on the front end. We just need more exposure to the stimulus. Next step, complexity. Add the walking, add your duration on the walking, add different patterns, right? Going to zigzag. Like,
Mm-hmm.
again, gamify, gamify, add different stimulus response. Now we're playing red light, green light. Go, stop, go, stop, go, stop, right? And that will enhance the skill to the next level. Then we can add intensity, and then we have to adapt to that as well, right? I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's a really good progressional pattern for not just a suitcase carry, not just a course training, but movement patterns in general.
For sure.
Bracing and breathing, it should almost really, I think, be, and I mean, I know you're going to be a fan of this, part of our like primal movement patterns, right?
100%.
As much as they're not technically movement, that's a lie too. They're moving the diaphragm. Um,
Well, it's needed, right?
it's an innate
They
skill that applies
they're
to
a
everything.
part of the movement patterns.
Yeah,
It's you should be able to brace in all of these different movement patterns. It's not necessarily its own. I mean, it is a skill, but it's not a primal skill in it of itself. It's the integration of that skill that
yeah,
is primal in nature, at least to me.
yeah,
Um, and I mean that is a good point because at some point we're talking about core stability, we're talking about core training. We have to integrate these skills into our sport practice.
yeah,
We have to make athletes aware of how do you use this newfound skill that is core expansion or that is anti-lateral flexion, anti-rotation? And that's where I see the good coaches become great coaches, not just good athletes becoming great athletes, by understanding the sport and relaying what that drill is doing or what the goal is to some sort of skill based practice or skill based skill. Like I can directly equate doing a wrestling stance payloft press with heavy fucking weight to you being in a wrestling position and being able to brace your core before you having to move into impact. Like a very long payloft press from a wrestling stance, and you're holding it 10-second ISO, and then you let go of the band and do a jump lunge. That's a fucking wrestling shot. That's a
Mhm.
fucking wrestling shot. It doesn't have to be that specific. But if you can make that athlete understand, like, oh, that feeling I was feeling with the payloft press, that's exactly what this is. That is what my sport is doing. That's going to increase the transfer because now they made that bridge. Now they made that understanding of how I'm supposed to do this, how my coach that's watching my biomechanics extremely closely wants me to do this in the weight room. It's the exact same thing, just a little bit more sport specific or in my sport on the mat. So I can do the same fucking thing. And if you make that bridge, it's going to immediately increase transfer ability and increase their ability to use those bracing strategies you just spent all that fucking time on.
Right, and again, this speaks to the quality of of the movement pattern that we're doing, right? Like said about like abdominal crunch or like abdominal flexion, right? That like has a place in MMA,
Great
has
for
a place
jiu-jitsu
in stretching,
athletes. I
right?
love like GHG sit-ups. I throw them in all my jiu-jitsu or my people that play guards games.
But again, we can scale this in an exercise or strength quality type of argument as far as when we're in jiu-jitsu, we need it isometrically, we need it with capacity because if we're rolling for a long time, we're going to be doing this on repeat, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even in a striker into MMA, like there's a ton of abdominal flexion and hip flexion that happen in a flying knee,
Yep.
right? So let's train that dynamically,
Mm-hmm.
right? So take a med ball, throw it overhead at the wall from a seated position, right? There's different exercises and frameworks to look at a movement rather than okay, do 100 sit-ups,
Yep.
which is common, unfortunately.
And lazy.
What'd you say?
I said and lazy.
Oh yeah, yeah. I thought you threw shit. I thought you said somebody's name. That would have been
No,
wild.
no, I would
Awesome, but
not
I'm
do
sure
that.
no way. But I mean, just be aware of the lens and the purpose for your training, right? Like just like Austin's saying, like the transfer to sport is the end goal,
Mm-hmm.
and so we can't just live on our box of like, oh, everybody is bad at squatting. We're gonna teach a squat for 9 months,
Yep.
right? It's like yes, squatting is important and we should have a good base of squatting, but like squatting is not the skill that athletes are competing at.
No, no, but then yeah, they need to do it. It's going to increase their overall outcome, but they don't necessarily need to compete at that or hit a whole bunch of one rep max. Same to be said about core training, same about any skill. But for whatever
Mm-hmm.
reason, core always seems to be the one that people don't understand.
It's like exclusively strength endurance.
Right, exactly. Well, it's exclusively trunk flexion. That's all they care about, and maybe that's because of society. Maybe that's I really I think it's society probably, or misconceptions on from bodybuilding transfer over to sports performance. But
Mm-hmm.
people really just typically don't understand that a good stable core actually it's just rigid enough, but not too rigid. It doesn't need to be all fucking muscle and no fat and nothing to push into, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I want to get across is that it's okay to not have a six pack and be a fucking killer athlete. Look at Roy Nelson.
Yeah, right.
That motherfucker's a savage, and he had a keg on keg.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a whole nother argument. Like body composition doesn't determine athletic skill
Yeah.
exclusively.
Well,
But
that's my biggest. I'll say that's my biggest argument when I talk with high school athletes or
yeah,
college athletes is that like why can't we do more sit-ups? Why? Well, first of all, you're prone to
we
disc
need arm
herniations.
farm.
Your entire sport is prone to a disc herniation.
Yeah,
So
right.
why do you need more like flexion in your life?
Yeah,
Arm farm's the same thing. But
yeah.
for whatever reason, if we could get high school athletes and college athletes to buy into the fact that six packs don't necessarily matter, athletics in America are going to go way the fuck up.
But dude, looking cool and looking good naked is a very important and real piece of a lot of people's
For sure. When you're done being an athlete.
lives. Well, sometimes we fail to prioritize that.
But
So, but
that's
no,
what I
no,
got.
I totally agree. Like, I want the power barrel of the keg all day, baby.
All day. Sweet baby Ray. If you guys got to get in touch with us, please look at the show notes. There's going to be emails and Instagrams available there. If you need any sort of programming, we have custom programs, memberships, and preset programs all available at buildingafighter.com. If you or one of your loved ones just finished up the wrestling season and looking for a program to get you kind of kick started towards next season, need some strength conditioning, we have programs available for wrestling as well. Again, buildingafighter.com. It's Dr. Austin Shane,
Alex Friedman, and I'm
and
gonna go do
we
some sit-ups.
are out.